Hello. Hello, everyone. How's it going? I'm Scott Westerfeld, and victory points suck. That's what we're here to talk about today. If we could put that, yeah, there we go. You know it's real. It's on a PowerPoint slide. So how many of you people actually know who I am? So yeah, like a tenth. To the rest of you, I want to explain it. I'm not really a game designer. I'm coming to this from a very different perspective. I'm best known for a series of books called Uglies. I wrote them back in 2000. I mean, they first came out back in 2005. It's like that Twilight Zone where everyone has to get an operation to be beautiful. It's that, but a trilogy. It's surprising. I always thought I was writing this fairly nostalgic piece of science fiction about body image, but it turned into a big deal. It's published in like 30 countries. And because of that, I got to do whatever I wanted next. Like my agent was like, yo, you could write any damn thing you want now. They'll publish it. So it turns out what I wanted to publish was a steampunk retelling of World War I, starring the son of the Archduke Ferdinand and a cross-dressing Scottish girl on a giant flying whale. It had art by the amazing Keith Thompson. This was the end papers showing that the Darwinist powers use strange living creatures as their warcraft, and of course the clanker powers had big walking World War I tanks. And it got me a lot of notice, in particular from people in the gaming community. And people started coming to me and saying it would be cool to do a Leviathan game. We like living airships. We like walking World War I tanks. We like the word Leviathan. These are all cool. And what was awesome about this is that I have been a wargamer from way back. This is where I established my bona fides. My first game was Blitzkrieg. I don't know if any of you have read that. It's Great Blue versus Big Red, or Big Red versus Great Blue. It's a really weird sort of World War II game that back when they thought you had to license Germany and France and England, so they just made up countries. I also played first edition D&D. I like that I'm getting like, yeah. My first game that I really loved was, this is my real copy of Dune. I didn't just Google this. A lovely game. I saw some people playing out there the other day, and man, is it ugly. I had forgotten what games looked like in 1979. Yeah, check that out. You youngins will realize how good you have it. So I want to tell you one little story about my early gaming days. It was a game called, there have been a few games called this, but this was called Global War, SPI. Let's get that swastika off the screen. And it came out in the 70s, maybe the early 70s. It was a monster of a game. For some reason, they decided to model all of World War II on a global map, which meant you had giant piles of counters in Europe and just these sort of vast wastelands everywhere else with nothing on them. It was a tweezer fest of the worst order. And you see those white lines in the oceans? That's the Commonwealth, the UK's merchant marine fleet in being. And that was like the first 45 minutes of setup was getting the merchant marines where they were supposed to go. And then it was one of those games where your first night was setting it up and remembering the rules. Like that was your first 3 hours. And once I played it through completion one time. It took multiple weekends. It survived a cat attack, which was like 45 minutes of reconstruction, and who knows if it really, if we put things back where they were supposed to be. And I kid you not, We went down to the very last turn, and it's one of those games where to win, Germany has to not lose before when they historically lost. And there was this attack on Berlin in late 1945. And my side, me and my pals, the Allies, would win if we rolled a 2 through 6. The entire game, the entire 40-something hour commitment. And we would lose if we rolled a 1. I don't think I have to tell you the end of that story. But it was one of my favorite gaming experiences ever. It's a terrible game. It was a terrible outcome. It was, in many ways, just a terrible, backbreaking experience that I would never want to repeat. But it taught me something very important as a sort of 13-year-old that Hollywood would continually teach me again, which is that the fate of democracy is always decided by a fist fight. That in truly epic and important confrontations, it's always one little thing at the last moment that decides who wins, and that is good narrative. Because of all those games I played since then, this is the one I'm talking about 40 years later. And that is why victory points suck. I'm more a storyteller than anything else. So I'm going to tell you another story now. This is a story I just made up for the purposes of this. Okay. Meet Mario and Lei Win. Childhood friends, brilliant young people. They're hanging out. They're having fun. They're good friends. Until one day, Mario says, "I'm going to be the richest man in the world one day." Lei Win, of course, says, "Well, maybe you'll be the richest man, but I'm going to be the richest person in the world." And so the challenge is thrown. He says, "Let's have this fight. Let's do this." So, of course, the rest of their lives are spent in this engagement. They go to school, they learn how to do computery things, they invent stuff. They found empires of commercial gain. They place workers. They control areas. On and on and on, this conflict takes them through their life as they try to make more money than the other. And of course, as they grow old, a strange thing happens. They start to say, what if my wonderful things I've created in this life, my patents, my companies, my empires, my Rolls-Royce collection, my cars, what if they're not going to be really, what if they're not going to be assessed properly? I better just turn them all into money. So they start selling everything off. In the end, of course, or maybe they don't do that. Maybe they just decide on some incredibly complicated rubric to evaluate everything in their wood, their grain, their Picassos, their houses, their cars, their relationships, their political influence. Maybe they'll boil it all down into one thing. So toward the end of their life, they spend about 5 years, a significant portion of the contest, waiting for the accountancy to be done. Of course, this whole time, they're not really having fun. They're not appreciating their wealth. They're just sitting there eating beans, waiting for this answer. Because they've sold all their houses. They've sold all their cool stuff. In the end, of course, Lei Win has won the contest. She has $84 billion, and Mario only has $83 billion. Now, this story sucks. That's the main thing I want you to take away from this, is that this is a terrible story, and yet I have played at least 100 games that tell this story, that tell something like this. I'm often asked for writing advice, and one of the things I say, my sort of generic piece of writing advice for young writers is to finish everything. And they don't like that because, of course, when you're a young writer, when you're any kind of writer, most of the time you'll do stuff and you'll start things and you'll have good ideas, great premises for a book, and you'll go for a while and you'll like the characters. But then when it starts to lose steam, you'll suddenly decide this is never going to be a good novel. This is never going to be the best novel in the world, so I'm going to stop. The result of that is that you have lots of writers out there who've written 147 beginnings and 27 early middles and 13 last middles and no endings, which means they're really pretty good at beginnings because they've gotten good at it, and they've gotten progressively less good as they go along. And we've all read this novel, right? You've read this, especially first novels. I love first novels. I love the weird broken masterpieces that someone who's never written a novel before produce. But the problem is that, they have good beginnings, they have okay middles, and then they fall apart at the end. And that's very much like what happens in a lot of games. I'm fascinated by the premise. I'm fascinated by the mechanics and the gameplay. And we talk a lot about the mechanics and the gameplay in our industry. We don't talk about victory conditions enough, I don't think. And I think a lot of victory conditions kind of suck. This is called Freytag's pyramid, which is a terrible name for it because it's not a pyramid. It's not even three-dimensional, nor is it a triangle. But that's what it's called. And of course, everybody knows this: exposition, complication, escalation, climax, resolution. And it is a pretty common element, particularly in Western art. I don't think it's inherent to all stories everywhere, told by all people, nor should it be, but it is part of our collective experience. And that climax there is the fist fight on Air Force One that determines the fate of democracy. Now, with many games, we have replaced that narrative model with this narrative model, which is rules explanation, which should be longer than that, complication, which means something different in war games and something more unfortunate than it does in movies, escalation, then accounting, and then resolution. Now, of course, you're saying, well, they don't always have accounting. A lot of games, you have your victory point tracker right there, which, of course, changes the narrative progression to this. As I said, I played Root yesterday, and this is something, of course, this is why we started hiding our victory points from each other, which is mad, which is a weird thing to do. Like, the hidden victory points has always struck me as one of the strangest constructions ever. Like, can you imagine a basketball game where they hid the score? And then at the end, the crowd would quiet down, and the referees would huddle and confer and go through the box score, and then the score would be shown. Like, no one would play basketball. So it's almost like we've tried to fix something by making it worse, or at least weirder. And and this leads me to one of my, this is Westerfeld's law of game design, which is if you have to fix a story by hiding its climax, then it's not a very good story. If you have to trick people into caring about the middle because they've already lost by not telling them they've lost, then something's a little bit broken there, and you need to work on that. So that story with Mario and Lei Win, I did something to my, I played a sort of a trick on a lot of my novelist friends. I wrote that story up and said, one of my students brought this story to me, and I'm having trouble explaining why it's a bad story. Can you give me your advice? So I have some blurbs for that story, which is the story of all games with victory points. Holly Black said, "We know what the characters want, but not why they want it or what it will cost them if they lose the conflict, the stakes." And I think sometimes that is the case with war games. We assume that our players don't want to lose because that's baked into the word lose. But there's no other thing beyond that. There's no moment beyond that, no idea past that. Sometimes that's solved, sometimes it isn't. Obviously, if you're playing a World War II game, you kind of know what that means. But it doesn't always work that way. Sarah Kuhn said, what's the difference between the two protagonists? More important, how does what they want change during their contest? And I thought that was a really interesting observation, a really interesting question, something that some games address. Obviously, your objectives and your motivations change, but do they change because you want them to change, or because someone gives you a card that says you now have a different objective? And what's the difference between those two things? John Scalzi got really indignant. It's evident that during, so he's already ranted for like a page and a half. Also, it's evident through the decades of empire building and money accruing, the two characters haven't learned anything either about themselves or the world. If they're so singularly and focused on beating the other in a pointless contest, they're not actually that brilliant. I think I said, brilliant young people at some point in my little, his response was 5 times longer than the story I actually told. And I think that's true too. Like, if you don't understand why these people are at odds, what they're trying to do, what they're trying to win, then it can be very difficult to see them as anything but kind of petty. And of course, when we talk about characters in games, it's pretty difficult to know what we mean. Do we mean the assigned character, like in a game of Dune, I am Paul Atreides? Or maybe I'm House Atreides, because Paul could, die. So I'm sort of this weird hovering zeitgeist. I can be like all the allies, I can be all the Axis, I can be... And so we're not 100% sure who our characters are all the time. And that can be difficult too. Sarah Dollard, who's a TV writer, probably haven't heard of her, but she wrote, she's like the only woman to ever write Doctor Who in the Moffat era. She said something really great, which is, what if the characters come to the realization that their competition was always secondary to their relationship? Like a good TV writer, she went writer's room on me. All the novelists were like, this sucks. But the TV writers, a lot of them came back and tried to make it good. And they all came down to, could these guys hook up at the end? Or Javier Grillo-Marxuach instead said, I'm just name dropping now, he was like, what if Lei Win wins and then Mario just says, well, I'm still the richest man in the world. So like having bitter, having your characters wind up with an unexpected outcome is so common in novels. It's so common in movies for what they thought they wanted to turn out to be something completely different than what they got. And that to me is something that, I don't see enough in games, is a kind of, it happens in the metagame, obviously. A lot of times we're like, that was terrible, I rolled a 1, and fascism now rules the world. But I have a good story to tell in 40 years if I ever do a games talk. Like, there are meta reasons why games can go wrong, and maybe this comes into the context of a meta reason. Maybe this is the meta reason we play all our games, is because we like or dislike or want to have fractious interactions with the people we're playing with. But I'd also like to see that stuff happen in games more. So I kind of want to fix this story. I want to tell it again, and I want to make it a little bit different. So meet Mario and Lei Win, brilliant young people who are very interested in rocketry. They like hanging out and building rockets for each other and launching them. I blew my special effects budget there. And one day, Lei Win announces, I'm going to be the first woman on Mars. And Mario says, well, maybe that's true, but I'm going to be the first person on Mars. And that is going to be awesome. Nah, 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 nah. So the course of their young lives has been set. They go to the School of Engineering and Applied Science, which is real, you can Google it. And there, Mario continues to perfect his rocket, to work hard with a singular purpose, to be the first person on Mars. Lei Win has her other shaped spacecraft, which is cooler because it has guns. So they're both working on that, but they're not just working on rockets. There's all sorts of other things you need for a mission to Mars. You need technologies to help you survive the planet, to help you survive the trip. There's lots of different pieces that you have to put into place. So this is my favorite of all the photos. Lei Win has her levitator thing, and that's Mario's space helmet to make sure he lives. Now, an unfortunate thing is happening as this story goes on, which is that Lei Win is creeping ahead. She looks like she might have a bit of a runaway victory going on. Her life support system is already done. Mario's is a bit shaky. Her spacecraft is in much better shape, he realizes, as they have lunch one day, and she whips out the model. And it seems like Mario is falling behind. So he makes a risky decision. He decides that his untested prototype will have to go directly into production. And one day, 3 weeks before her scheduled launch, he takes off into the sky. He zooms across the cosmos. His life support system works fine. He flies, but when he lands on Mars, it turns out that his wonky space helmet doesn't work 100%. The glass starts to crack. His eyes starts to bulge out in that cool way that Hollywood does that probably doesn't really happen. And when Lei Win comes 2 weeks later and lands on Mars to cut his head off, she discovers his broken and frozen body on the red tundra, cradles him in her arms, and says, "In another life, I could have called you friend." Now that is actually a better story. I still told it kind of stupid. I admit that. But it makes more sense. It feels more like a story to me. I sent that as a fix to my writer friends, and they were like, "Oh yeah, this is way better." Because victory point stock and victory conditions are rather good. They can tend to be much better. And one of the reasons why that is that we care more about characters who want specific things than we do about characters who want generic things. The problem with victory points is that they are kind of like money. They try to absorb a lot of different stuff. They try to tell you the relative value of your wood and your grain and your influence and your leftover gold and the gold you spent on victory point modules and and your castles and your fenced in sheep and your not fenced in sheep. And they try to make that all into one thing, which is what leads us to these large accounting situations. But there's also another problem with victory points that I discovered in my game of Root last night. I was the Vagabond. Vagabond. It's really good, playing with a friend. And we were doing quite well, because the birds were doing well, and then they blew up, and I was like, all right, we're ahead now. It's hard to drag the Vagabond back because you can't find him half the time. And we had made this really great alliance with the cats. And this had been a tremendously fruitful alliance. They had built cat teapots and cat bags and all sorts of cat stuff for us. We'd given them lots of cards that they had used to chop up the birds, who were also our enemies. And it felt real and it felt awesome until we only needed 2 points left. And the best way to get that was to kill some cats who we had just given a teapot or something. Or they'd given us a teapot. And it was like, it wasn't what my Vagabond wanted. It actually wasn't even what I wanted. Or the person I was playing with. But it was what the game wanted us to do. It wanted us to stab some kittens for no reason whatsoever. And I tried really hard to think of an in-game explanation for why we would be suddenly go from a laughing, wonderful vagabond whose victory points had come out of our relationships. We were down with the Mouse King, the Mouse Rebellion. We were down with the cats. This is what made us powerful. This is what had given us all our victory points. And suddenly to get over the line, it was like, stab the cats. Because otherwise, they're going to get there before you, because they're about to control two separate corners of the board. And I was like, what is happening? And like so many books I've read by young writers, I was thrilled and amazed by the premise. I loved a lot of the characterization and the feel of playing those characters. I loved the mechanics and the way that, we all know Root is cool as fuck, right? But the ending just made me scratch my head, and I didn't get it. And so I kind of wanted to think a little bit about how, one of the reasons I tell young writers to finish everything is that endings are really hard. Endings are hard to write. And the more you write of them, the better you'll get. And one of the things you learn, if you write a lot, if you finish everything you write and you write those endings, is you figure out which stories are good to begin with and which premises are good to begin with because they have an ending in their soul. There's that first, I don't start a book, and most of my friends who write novels don't start a book without knowing what the ending is going to be. We may not outline, we may not have any idea how to get there, we may change the ending along the way, but the idea that you would start anything without knowing what the victory conditions are, what the end is, just strikes me as a kind of madness, and it's a madness that afflicts a lot of games. So just to talk a little bit about the way games fit into the idea of story, Aristotle has this great quote, which is, drama is character revealed through action. And I think that's a really solid way to look at things. And of course, the story version of this is story is people revealed through choices. It's you. It's the way that, when you put a character in a situation where they have to make a choice, obviously that's what makes them interesting. It's great to do your, middle class person going through their life. They have angst with their parents. They have, they're worried about their kids. They have characteristics. But it's when they see a burning house and have to decide whether to go in or not that they really become interesting. And yes, it's interesting to want to go to Mars. And it's cool to have to go to Mars. It's a fun story. And obviously, one of the great things about that Martian fix to the money parable is that I can see that the difference between being the richest person in the world and the second richest person in the world isn't really that much. But the difference between being the first person on Mars and the second person on Mars is huge, because everybody remembers Neil Armstrong's name, and Gus Grisham, maybe, is the second person to go on the moon. I don't even remember. And my dad worked for NASA. So what I want to ask players is, are you willing to risk all of your stuff that you've been building along the way for this one chance at victory? Do you want to go for a knockout? Do you want to play some big risk and reward? Do you want to risk player elimination to try to win this game now? Because that's what we ask of characters in books and movies all the time. Are you going to run into that burning house to save a kid? Or are you going to sit there and be like, could have done that, didn't do it, for the rest of your life? And here's the third version of that. Victory points are unowned motivations further flattened by relentless optimization. They are the opposite of story being revealed through choices. They're the opposite of drama. Wow, that's really great. I should stop there. So let me talk about a real game, another real game for once, and talk about just a fix for it. How many of you have played Champions of Midgard? Yeah, Champions Midgard, quite good. For those of you who don't know, it's set in a Viking village place, and it's beset by trolls on an almost mechanical basis. Trolls show up like fortnightly or something and have to be dealt with. Otherwise, troll blame is assigned. It's really fun. You draft dice, you place workers, you grab these sort of parties together and you go fight little monsters who are local, or you get a ship and you fight bigger monsters who are farther away and worth more stuff and more points. The monsters are cool because all of their names are fun to say. They all have Viking-y, Nordic names. It's really cool. I like the village that you're defending. It's full of interesting places to go. There's a stave church where you can go get sort of luck, and there's a sage's house. There's a runesmith and a blacksmith, and there's a smokehouse because there's meat involved. There's lots of food. You take food on your journeys, and then tellingly and annoyingly, at the end of the game, when you're adding up your victory points, meat counts. Meat is important for your victory points. There's even a destiny card, which is if you have the most meat, you get a bonus. Like, can you imagine being that kid's parent? And during the christening, the guy with one weird eye, or the closed over eyes from the Vikings, comes to your house and says, your child's destiny will be meat. And I swear, you can sail this boat and survive a whirlpool and a kraken and murder some big monster, and you come back and someone whips out the meat card and they get double meat points, and that's why they had that big stack of meat the whole time and they win? And that's supposed to be, and it's that's Euro. That's yes, well, we have many different motivations. And you're so when, by the way, the plot, I forgot to tell you the plot of Champions of Midgard, which is the old Jarl, I'm just going to say Earl. The old Earl is dead, and the person who collects the most victory points will be the new Earl. Okay, sure, fine. So what happened in that story where I lost because the other guy had more meat? Where I got off the boat with the head of a gorgon or some unpronounceable fucking thing. And they were like, yes, but Hans gave us a really good feast. So we made him Earl while you were gone. And we've all experienced that gameplay, right? And it's really fun, man. I love it. I think it's a fun part of the game, is trying to figure out what the hell just happened with these mechanics and why did they do that to us, which is fine. But I will say this, if a story forces readers to joke their way through logic failures, you might want to fix that. And I think we've all gotten really good as gamers at making up weird stories to make the little story and thematic and logic failures in our games make sense. And it's part of the fun of it, and if you're the person in your gaming group who's really good at it, then you don't want to see this go away, because that's part of that's part of your pleasure of playing the game, is that you're the guy who saves it when things go wrong. So what's my fix for Champions of Midgard? I think it's almost bizarre that Champions of Midgard, with the theme of Vikingness, with the theme of the old Earl being dead, didn't do this. And I've always found it completely mystifying. What if the old Earl was killed by a monster? And what if the new Earl is the person who kills that monster? That's obvious, right? Nordic saga. You look up Nordic saga in the dictionary, it just says revenge, get revenge. And of course, you're okay, would that really work? Would it really be good? But what about all those victory points? What about all that stuff I did the rest of the game? Well, when you kill a big monster, what if you don't get victory points? What if you get a cool weapon? or a cool, some monsters you get give you rerolls, some monsters you get give you other things. What if there's a big deck of possible monsters for you to kill? Like this time you played, the Earl was killed by a sea monster, so you got to go fight on a ship. Or the Earl was killed by a tree dude, or that guy, who's fortunately covered up by me. Now, so what are the issues with this fix? What are the problems with this strategy? Well, one of the things is that, like, only one player is going to do this? Like, are we really going to all gather around while one player says, okay, I think I can go kill Tree Dude now because I spent all my time at the Stave Church getting the flame axes that get double points on Tree Dude, and I'm ready to go. So everybody else gathers around, and maybe there's somebody who had more stuff who's like, damn it, I should have gone last turn. And we all sit around, and some dice are rolled, and somebody wins. And there'll be people who were never in it because they fell too far behind, and there'll be people who are annoyed because that guy got kind of lucky, and I was going to go next turn, and I had more stuff than him anyway because I played better the whole way, but you didn't take the risk. Now, there'll be some disappointed players because some people want to only be given, out of the game what they got, what they put into it. They played better the whole way and you just got lucky. They played better the whole way and you just took a better risk. And in a way, I'm okay with that. I'm down with that. I think we've trained players to expect victory points, to expect a certain kind of gaming logic, but to throw away a certain kind of story logic. And I think anytime you've designed a game, you have to decide which of those things is more important to you. If you do want a game that rigorously categorizes every player optimization and rewards them for understanding all of your cunning and beautiful mechanics, then go ahead and make victory points. But if you want a game with a big fight at the end that has an actual climax and feels like a story, then you might want to rethink that stuff and focus on victory conditions and on final battles and even on boss fights. I mean, as I said, it takes me back to my game of Global War. It was a good game not because of how it was designed, but because it got us to that point where it all came down to one die roll. And although at the level of a game player, there was something super unsatisfying and bogus about that, again, I'm still talking about it 40 years later. And that's a good game. Because the fate of Viking government is always decided by a fist fight. Like, if we know anything about Vikings, it's that, right? And what I want is more games that look like this. Rules, exposition, complication, escalation, dude fighting a big monster, resolution. Now, maybe you're asking me this, which is, wouldn't boss fights eventually become just as boring as counting up victory points? No, they would not. That's dumb. Like, a boss fight is always going to be more interesting than counting up victory points, especially if it's a Viking. I also think that we, obviously we don't have to focus entirely on, all right, this is where I'm going to shift gears. There are situations which are stickier, which aren't just about boss fights, that, that don't lend themselves naturally to getting to Mars, to win the boss fight. There are weird, complicated situations like, let's say, a hostage rescue. A hostage rescue isn't like a boss fight because you don't just win. You don't just take them out or be taken out. There are complexities to it. There are, there could be hostages killed, hostages wounded, SWAT officers killed, SWAT officers wounded, hostages could be spirited away and still be hostages. There could be cameras watching. There could be cameras not watching. There could be, all kinds of things can happen in the course of a fraught event like that. So how do we model stuff like that? Of course, the victory point version of that is we do some kind of math. Something really offensive like this happens. Like rebel casualties, hostages saved times 7, SWAT casualties times 2, hostages killed times 3, subtract. We do this stuff. But I think that like that is almost just as bad to like come out with a number at the end of all these complexities. I keep comparing victory points to money in this, and I think they both have the same kinds of absurdities. Money is weird and crazy and absurd for the same reasons it's useful. Money says everything's the same. We can compare everything so that we, understand it. We can compare our wheat and our grain and our fenced-in sheep and our unfenced-in sheep. We can know things like mocha latte equals 20 minutes labor, so do I want it or not? But money also delivers us absurd equations like Elon Musk is worth 23 million school teachers. Money will always break. Math will always break. Reliance on gameplay mechanics will always break because someone will come along who's not smarter than you, but who's found a little situation that you didn't find because there's a lot more people playing a game than designing it, and they will break you somehow. So there are situations where you'll just kind of have to. This is the weirdest thing I'm going to say. I love victory conditions, but also sometimes we're just going to have conditions, and we're going to end a game with 6 rebel casualties, 11 hostages saved, 2 SWAT casualties, 3 hostages killed, and that's what happened. Maybe that's just what happened, and we don't have a clue as to whether that means a win or a loss. Maybe we just play again next time, or maybe we never know. Maybe gaming is players revealed through their self-determined motivations and strategies. Maybe that's what we find out when we play against somebody is, did they care more about the hostages or more about kicking my ass? Did they care more about keeping the integrity of their own rescue team, or did they care more about, saving people? I'm interested in my friends' responses to that. In a way, I'm not interested in my friends' ability to do math and game the system and say, at this point, I could just nuke the whole building and win by 1 point. Because there's always going to come some moment where there's an absurdity in victory points, where killing the cats is okay, and in fact, it's the only thing you could do because you got to get to dinner. You're so hungry, and you want to be the vagabond, but you're so hungry, and if you get to kill the cats, you A, win, and B, you get to leave and go eat. And there's really good beer at this place, right? You've been thinking about it all day, so you kill the cats. And I think there's something to be said for games that don't have victory conditions per se. They do have climaxes. They do have moments at the end that are more important than any other moment, but where we decide as gamers whether they're how to take them on and how to interpret them and how to make them into a story. And I think that is okay. It's what we do with role-playing games all the time. We don't, did you win D&D today, darling? It's something everyone's mother has asked them at some point, or father, and you're like, no, it's not like that. And I think some board games would also be happily and wonderfully constructed with endpoints and climaxes and big battles at the end, but uncertainty as how to interpret those events. And I'm interested in that as well. Because in some ways, victory itself is absurd. There are no real victories in life. There are no real, nobody ever wins a novel. You don't necessarily win in a film. What you do is you get a set of events that fall out, and you get to talk about and think about, and that's what makes stories interesting. And I just would hope that any of you who are game designers listen to this frantic plea and think a little bit less about mechanics and victory points and more about climaxes and some ambiguities and some big fucking boss fights. Thank you very much. So we got like 14 minutes. Does anybody have a question about anything? Like flying whales? Yeah.
I was playing Diplomacy recently. I was just struck by how bad it is at simulating World War I. Like, it's supposedly attempting to. Like the end of World War I, it wasn't just, well, then the British backstabbed the French and took over all of Europe.
Right. Right.
So they could get some victory points. And I'm just, are there any examples of games that have these ambiguous endings? And do you think gamers would actually accept that? It feels like a lot of people would be really unsatisfied by that, as excited by that.
I think that's probably true. Have any of you played a game also from the 70s called Imperium? It was about an upstart Terran empire finding its way, into the galaxy and bumping into an older thing called the Empire, and so the two players were, one person was the president of Earth, and the other player was the local governor of this sector, who's like, oh, another one of these new races has come along to bedevil me. And it had a victory point marker, but it was the kind I like, which is it started at 5, and things that clever things that the Earth player did pushed it up, clever things that the Empire player did pushed it down. If it got to 10 or 0, the war would end. But it wouldn't be the end of the game. What would happen was you would sort of freeze things, like the politicians would negotiate peace. You would freeze things and you'd play another little mini game, which was the peace. And what was cool about it is that the peace would tend to favor the person who lost the war, because their government is like, we will build the dreadnoughts secretly. And they would get to build bigger ship classes would open up. They would have sort of more money. So the person who lost the war, who won the war, would sort of be like, maybe I shouldn't have done that. I wanted to get out of that war because then now I can build some fortifications around my planets because that's what I get to do during my, about the stuff I gained. So there was this wonderful sort of push and pull and ambiguity in as you played. And of course, it was really long time scales because the war could last 17 or 18 years. The peace could last 20 or 30 years. But you were watching this thing unfold. It was really interesting and unexpected. And the victory conditions were just elimination. So they were kind of boring. But you always knew earlier, you just conceded. And it was fine. But it never felt like you were doing things purely for the purpose of the game telling you to do them. It felt like a simulation of the kind of stuff that you would have to experience as a real politician. Did you have a question? Sorry.
Thanks for a great talk. Awesome.
Thank you.
And it's really great to, I think, push designers to think about alternative ways to structure their games. But there are a fair few problems that come up with that, of course. And let's take the Midgard example. If you focus a game like that towards killing a boss, then you're narrowing the possibilities of what you can and cannot do, and how your structure of goals. It's not about winning. It's about setting up a structure of short-term and long-term goals for players, right? Would all narrow towards killing the boss. And that simply reduces the variety of possible actions and thus also agency. So then,
sure,
that's one problem.
Okay, let me respond to that very quickly. I forgot to say this, but maybe one of the things you're building up is a set of cards, and maybe your opponents don't know this, which helps the boss. And so when they go out with their giant war fleet, you just kill your opponents that way by helping the boss. So there's and possibly there's alliances. Possibly becomes a cooperative game where you all kill the boss together.
But it becomes a fighty or a war game.
Yeah, but it does become But it's already pretty bloody.
And the other thing is that you're risking collapsing the middle because of the race issue. It becomes ultimately you're modeling there a race, and there's I've mostly designed race kind of games, and this is why I'm talking about this, I guess. There's a big problem where, as you said, if you're falling behind in a race, then what do you do, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you lose engagement from players, and then not only does it deflate that player or players, but also deflates the sense of accomplishment of the win,
right.
of the actual winner if they start leading a little bit.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, that happens with victory points all the time. I mean, it's one thing I like. As I was working on this, I was thinking a little bit about Flamme Rouge, and thinking that is such a good game, and what if you just put numbers on the track and called them victory points? Would that become a bad game? No, it would not. And that's what's interesting about Flamme Rouge, is that you could just say those are victory points, but of course, they don't have the physics of victory points, because you're drafting and you're getting exhausted because of the wind. It's a bicycle racing game. Everyone's played it, obviously. It's a bicycle racing game, so like you're going through a track, and when you don't want to be ahead, because that means you're fighting through the wind. You're cutting. You're getting more exhausted. You want to be sort of in third place or second place. And the last thing you want is to drop off the end, which is also a huge freaking disaster. So I do think there are ways to give victory points and other kinds of things like that physics, so that or alternate strategies, like if you are at the end of the pack, maybe you start helping the monsters.
And final quick note, like the player set goals are really interesting. But
Yeah.
I think the problem with that, from a lot of player research that I've done, is that a lot of people find it hard to do that, or don't like that kind of ambiguity, and look towards games to give them a small pocket in their lives where things are structured and there are goals that are set for you and you can work towards it. While other players love setting their own goals, but that tends to be a little bit in the minority. So again, it creates a bit of issue there. And with with systems that are designed to create emergent narrative through rules like Dungeons and Dragons, that's not an issue, because that is what the experience is designed to do anyway. But for games that are more contest-like a lot of Euros, then that becomes a problem. Hence, victory points and hidden victory points.
Yeah. No, I know. Oh no.
I was curious about your thoughts on Black Orchestra. It seems to exemplify everything you've talked about. Sorry, with regards to narrative and getting to that climax where you have that one event.
Tell me about Black Orchestra. I've not played it.
Oh, okay. It's a cooperative game where you're trying to assassinate Hitler. You're playing the rebels in the German forces, conspiring to take him down. You have to get a bunch of items, reduce his forces, and roll some dice.
I mean, I do feel like cooperative games tend to have better victory conditions. When I play co-op, one of the reasons I like co-op games is that they tend to make sense to me. They're very rarely involve victory points. And even when you play like Pandemic Legacy and you do a lot of math at the end, it doesn't feel oppressive for some reason, and I'm not sure why, except that you've already spent like a fucking year on this, so 10 minutes of math is not that bad, and the interpretation of that math is not hidebound into you totally won or you totally lost. It's just like, the world sucks a lot more than it used to, but not as much as it could have if you didn't exist. And that's kind of what we all want to like go to our grave knowing, right? That's like the best. That's all I'm looking for now. So one more question, and then thank you. Sorry.
One thing that struck.
Sorry. Yeah. Go on.
One thing that struck me is that of all the characters in all the stories you told, the Vagabond was the most dynamic. His goals changed the most over the course towards the end. So it seems to me that the victory caused the player to make a rash decision at the end that goes wildly against the assumptions that everyone else had, whereas your Midgard Vikings had one goal and they're very static. Do you have any ways that you think that you could address that issue of a static endpoint or a victory condition?
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's very much a case-by-case basis. I mean, I did mention it a couple of times already, but I think it would be cool if when someone else goes off to kill the Viking monster, you could help them, or help the monster or curse them in some way. That sounds very Nordic to me. It sounds like stuff that happens all the time in the sagas. I like the idea of players deciding to throw chaos into last events, and to when there is a last battle, that's when you pick what side you're going to be on. Like, that would be cool. Rather than being assigned a sort of card at the beginning says that, you know, you're an agent of chaos from the beginning, just to discover that on the way you're like, I don't like these guys, I'm going to help the monster. I think that would be interesting too. Anyway, sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Definitely come up afterwards and talk to me. I missed a couple of you at my signing yesterday, so if you want to sign books, if you want me to sign books, I'm happy to do that now. I'll be like out there somewhere. Anyway, thank you very much. You're a great audience.